Presentation today is the first of its kind. I've never done this before, and I was given quite short notice in preparation for this, so please excuse any technical problems or difficulties. It's based on our Following Srila Prabhupada DVD series. Most of you know what this is. It's an 11 DVD set, and we started production on this in 2002. We were requested by the Srimananda Prabhu of ITV and Ekanath Prabhu of Bhaktivedanta Archives to put everything on DVD, because at that time there were some persons who were taking the material and independently putting it on DVD and trying to market it. So we started that project in 2002, and typically when I take up a project, it usually takes too long to finish. This is no exception. This ran longer than I ever imagined. And the reason for that was that we really wanted, actually a second generation devotee brought up in Gurukul. He was working with me as my first technical assistant. And he wanted to hear from me about, my experience filming Srila Prabhupada, what happened, and just the stories behind that service. And so we broadened that. I like that idea. And we broadened that to include all devotees who had any contact with Prabhupada at the time these films were taken. So we have actually, I did interviews with about 500 devotees, and about 335 are included in the series. There's 11 DVDs, and you'll hear about 31 hours of dialogue, commentary, explaining the background of what was happening at that time and place, a lot of stories about Srila Prabhupada, their experience with him. And it was a wonderful project to take up. I really became quite absorbed in hearing about Srila Prabhupada. And the more information I gathered, the more I wanted to gather. And I finally remember Srila Kirti Prabhu in Vrindavan, interviewing him.
In a closet.
Yeah, in a closet. Because, I usually went to festivals, so, most devotees would be at these festivals, and I could ask many of them to be interviewed. But it was very often very noisy at these places, and of course I wanted to try to get as quiet an atmosphere as possible, so I found a closet. The only quiet place was a closet in the MBT. It was a large closet. Still a closet. So he was grumbling a bit. It was a little hot at that time. Dr. Nakaswamy was also interviewed in the closet.
Closet Krishnas.
So and speaking about a presentation, I started out as a still photographer before I came to Krishna consciousness, and that was actually my introduction to the movement, was as a photographer covering the New York Temple. And I was trained, I actually have a master's degree in photography and film. So my first engagement in any kind of media was in still photography. So I was fascinated by many of the stills that are in the film frames of the DVD series. I calculated how many stills there are in 31 hours of video. Anyone like to guess?
1,000.
Huh?
1,000?
1,000?
A billion.
A billion. There's 2.5 million. So in the last 3 days I've been going through a few of these. Pull out a few that I thought would help tell a story. So we're going to see some stills of Srila Prabhupada, and also stills of personalities who interacted with Srila Prabhupada during his time with us. So it's going to be a bit of their comments from the series. I'll be reading some of that. And this is kind of a bit of an introduction to the series, and also a bit of just seeing nice still pictures of that time and place, especially Srila Prabhupada. The quality is not so good. Much of it was taken from Super 8 film, we had a mix of all different kinds of film, putting this together, Super 8, regular 8, and 16 millimeter. So, we'll start. I wanted to choose some music for this, and I didn't get a chance to choose music I wanted, so there'll be something here. So, I hope you will take interest in the presentation. Is there a line control for music? There. Okay, let's see how it comes out. So this is the Ananda Ashram. This is the ashram of Dr. Mishra. Srila Prabhupada met him early on in New York. And Srila Prabhupada stayed there at Dr. Mishra's invitation. And one person he met, Srila Prabhupada at the ashram. This is really the first film that we have of Srila Prabhupada in the West. I went to Ananda Ashram and interviewed the present head of that institution. Her name is Joan Subal. And she was actually asked by Dr. Mishra to serve Srila Prabhupada. And he needed at the ashram to do his service. And this is Dr. Mishra himself. And he was a Vedantist. He was a you can say an impersonalist, an impersonal school. And he didn't really, from the impression I get of the interview, he didn't really like Srila Prabhupada to speak so much. Because Srila Prabhupada he naturally emphasized Krishna as a supreme person. But to allow him to do kirtan. And this is some of the activities at the yoga ashram. We had Hatha Yoga. They also had classes, of course, in Vedanta. Also, this is Joan Subal at the time. This, you can see the intense grain, film grain on your face. This is taken from an old 16 millimeter print. Today she's the head of the ashram. She had a very wonderful experience actually with Srila Prabhupada. I'll read something from her commentary. After the program of Vedantic readings and chanting, Guruji would turn over the latter part of the evening to Swamiji. He would try to caution him and he'd say, Swamiji, only 15 minutes remaining, at most 20 minutes, Swamiji. And Swamiji would look at him very sincerely and say, I know, people need rest, it is late. I will do a little bit of chanting. But it was to no avail, because once Swamiji went into that divine chanting, the bhakti chanting, he lost all sense of time and space every time he chanted. And it was seldom that it was less than an hour. Now, all of this, you're not going to see the entire image, actually. Again, some technical stuff going on here. Okay, hold on just a moment. This is the storefront matchless gifts. And this is, of course, where Srila Prabhupada started his mission. He met, it's very interesting, Harigriva Prabhu met Srila Prabhupada in the Bowery, and he had previously gone to India on a freighter searching for a guru, and he couldn't find anyone. So he actually came back to America and at the Bowery met Srila Prabhupada at the beginning of his mission. Very interesting. And this is Srila Prabhupada being interviewed by Richard and Susan Whitty. Now, Richard and Susan Whitty, this was their first documentary film as 16 millimeter filmmakers. They were living in New York, and they had a job in a film production studio. And this was their first attempt at a film. And this was certainly Krishna's arrangement that they took this film. This is the film of Srila Prabhupada chanting in Tompkins Square Park. In 1982, my wife Vishaka Devi and I were in production for Your Ever Well Wisher, which is Srila Prabhupada's biography film. And at the time, we didn't have any films of Prabhupada in Tompkins Square Park. And of course, this was the very, very beginning. I was just, yearning for some films to turn up. And then actually a filmmaker called Jonas Mekas, he was an avant-garde filmmaker at the time, New York City, Lower East Side. And he had a film of Prabhupada in Tompkins Square, so I was very eager to see that, and he offered to give it to me. And he sent it to me, but it was the avant-garde film style at the time, just waving the camera, kind of wildly. So you see Prabhupada flash by, very flash by. I was very disappointed. And so we were ready to release Your Ever Well Wisher with no footage, maybe a few frames of that footage, as Prabhupada very beginning preaching. And then Puru Prabhu, who was the resident in New York Temple, he was running Govinda's. He was actually the guest manager, I believe. So Richard Whitty was very fond of prasadam. He was coming every day to Govinda's. And one day he said, I have a film of your spiritual master in Tompkins Square Park.
Wow. And
he just gave that film to Puru Prabhu, and then Puru contacted me, and then we included it in our first film. So this was the way Krishna arranges things sometimes. This particular shot of Srila Prabhupada is being interviewed. He says, the boys did it all. I've done nothing. Speaking about his first followers. Very wonderful interview. Here's some of the boys. In our series, you'll hear the chanting. Actually, Garga Muni is on the far left. You don't see him, but he's playing a sitar type instrument. But when he's being interviewed, he's lying on his side. I don't know how many have seen that interview. Very relaxed. And this is Srila Prabhupada framed with Srila Prabhupada in Tompkins Square Park. And just his intensity of his kirtan was just amazing. I'd like to read some of his prayer to Lord Krishna on the Jaladuta when he came to America. He says, "My dear Lord Krishna, you are so kind upon this useless soul, but I do not know why you have brought me here. Now you can do whatever you like with me. But I guess you have some business here. Otherwise, why would you bring me to this terrible place?" Most of the population here is covered by the material modes of ignorance and passion. Absorbed in material life, they think themselves very happy and satisfied, and therefore they have no taste for the transcendental message of Vasudeva. I do not know how they will be able to understand it, but I know by your causeless mercy, everything is possible because you are the most expert mystery. How will they understand the mellows of devotional service? Oh Lord, I am simply praying for your mercy so that I will be able to convince them about the message. Srila Prabhupada was completely dependent on the mercy of Krishna and his spiritual master. And his spiritual master's very strong desire was to see the preaching started again. So Srila Prabhupada's mission, of course, was just simply to fulfill his Guru Maharaj's desire. And this was the very beginning of that fulfillment. this is Srila Prabhupada arriving in San Francisco. After his success in New York, Mukunda Maharaj, who you see on the very right, he came out to San Francisco on Prabhupada's request. Actually, he was not planning to go to San Francisco. He wanted to get a break from New York. So Prabhupada indicated that he should try to start a temple in San Francisco. So he went there and made many contacts. One of them was with a person who had, I forget his name, but he had the Avalon Ballroom. And so Mukunda Maharaj organized a rock concert for Prabhupada to appear at, along with many famous musicians.
The other side, Shama Sundar, right?
That's Shama Sundar, yeah. This is Shama Sundar's first meeting with Srila Prabhupada.
And then Allen Ginsberg.
And Allen Ginsberg. Allen Ginsberg was he was of the Beat generation. And so Shama Sundar was very much caught up in that Beat generation. They were his idols, the leaders of the Beat generation. So Allen Ginsberg was one of the heads of that. So he figured that anyone who liked Prabhupada, if they liked Prabhupada, then he certainly liked Prabhupada. He found Prabhupada just completely mesmerized. He couldn't take his eyes off him. Let me read something from Allen Ginsberg. I did a lot of singing in the park, and so I used to come down, help out, and sing along too. I'd been singing Hare Krishna since 1963, and it seemed to me almost as if reinforcements had arrived from India. My idea at the time was that the more swamis the better, and the more spiritual teachers the better, because America seemed sunk in a morass of aggressive and murderous militarism in those days. This was right in the middle of the Vietnam War, and I'd come home from India via Saigon. So anyone going out on the street, particularly and singing in the street, seemed to lighten the whole American scene. That seemed like a breakthrough of joy and dancing, human voice, and so it seemed like a marvelous social contribution. Of course, we understand it was more than a social contribution; it was a spiritual revolution, meant to take people back home, back to Godhead, out of this social scene. Here, Prabhupada is on Hippie Hill. This is a place of gathering for the hippies. They come out and have kirtan and join the devotees in kirtan. Sometimes Prabhupada would join them. There's a little boy sitting in front of him. This is Jayananda on Hippie Hill. The devotee on the left is Nandarani. She was a very early devotee. So in the film you'll see many hippies circling Prabhupada and dancing. This is a comment from Dayananda Prabhu. Prabhupada had introduced something that all of the youth were really attracted to, and he was really something of a Pied Piper. You can see here how much everybody is participating. These are not just devotees, but all the people here in the park were completely open to this. As a matter of fact, so much so that they considered the Hare Krishna to be the hippie religion at this point in 1967 in San Francisco. So many hippies were in love with Srila Prabhupada and in love with the devotees and considered themselves very much a part of Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada was very, very happy to see these devotees chanting. Srila Prabhupada in New Jersey. After he went back to San Francisco, he had some heart trouble, actually. And he went to the Jersey Shore to recuperate. And while he was there, the devotees from San Francisco sent him a tape recording of Hare Krishna Mantra and a few other songs. So this is Govinda Dasi's contribution. She said, they sent a copy of this reel-to-reel tape, and it was so wild, and it was a brand new tune. They made up their own tunes, unheard of in New York. This was not done, and it was wild, horns and cymbals, and you name it. It was a full wild party, sounding kirtan. And some of the devotees in New York were, oh my gosh, what is this? But Prabhupada loved it. He was so happy, and I noticed this. He was so happy that they were still chanting. It didn't matter, it was a different tune. It didn't matter that there were wild hippies dancing in frenzies, and probably some of them were. Most of them even were still taking intoxication. Prabhupada loved the song. There was another one that they sent called Narada Muni, the Eternal Spaceman, which is a little record that they made. They were creative and innovative and far out. That's the kind of people that were in San Francisco. And Srila Prabhupada encouraged them, whereas the nature in New York was to criticize them and put them down because they weren't conservative enough. Prabhupada didn't have that mood at all. Instead, he encouraged both. So this is a film that called Swamiji that Damodar Prabhu produced. He produced quite a few films, Super 8, or little 8mm films. One of them is this one, Swamiji, another was Gurudev, another was The Full Nectarine, which was a play that was Lord Chaitanya. And actually Srila Prabhupada was going to India to try to get his health back at this time. And the devotees were quite shocked that he was leaving because his health was not good. He had that heart trouble. So they were thinking he may never come back. They didn't know what to make of that. So they asked Damodar Prabhu to make a film of Srila Prabhupada so that they could show the film when he was gone and meditate on that. So this is the film he made. These are stills from that film. It's really Srila Prabhupada just sitting in his room and chanting, very relaxed. So they would play this film and chant their japa. So this globe is very significant. Here are Govinda Dasi's comments. He used to sit and turn the globe, and he would meditate on the different countries, and he would say, Brahmananda, you shall go to Russia. Or a singer, you shall go to Japan. And someone else, you go to South America. You have to understand we had no money, we had no manpower, we had nothing. We're a handful of teenagers, 10 people in their early 20s who were rather eccentric, all of them. Because we had rejected our cultural values and we were following him like a Pied Piper. And he was telling us about these different countries we're going to go to open temples. He had his plan. It was not haphazardly done. I have a beautiful picture of Prabhupada sitting and turning the globe. He did it a lot. he meditated on the globe. And of course, today we can see the result of that meditation. Brahmananda Prabhu in front. This is Srila Prabhupada in Boston on a walk. At this particular time, actually Govinda Dasi's husband, Gaurasundar, he had been reading many books on the Vedic culture. And he read about Brahmins, and he had Brahmin friends. So he wanted to become a Brahmin. So he mentioned that to Srila Prabhupada, and then Srila Prabhupada decided to have a Brahminical initiation. But the women weren't included. So Govinda Dasi was very upset that her husband was getting Brahminical initiation and she wasn't. So she actually boycotted the lecture. She boycotted the Brahminical initiation. She didn't come. She was sitting at home and she was thinking, what? At one point she thought, what am I doing? Why am I here? And she ran down the street full speed and ran into the temple. And Srila Prabhupada, when she burst in, he said, Govinda Dasi, I knew you could not stay away. You would love to hear me speak. So anyway, when he understood that she was the reason for her boycott, then that was one of the reasons he decided to give ladies Brahminical initiation. And of course, Srila Prabhupada really studied the American scene, what was happening here. He saw that the boys and the girls, they were like equals in many ways. So he didn't, he submitted to that request, and that was the beginning of the Brahminical initiation for males, boys and girls. This is from Jadharani Dasi. On this particular day in Boston, he took us downtown where he first went and got off the Jaladuta boat. Because the captain was doing shopping, so he took Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was pointing out different places that he remembered. The next day, Prabhupada took all the boys for a tour of where he first landed. I was in the back, and I ran up so that I could walk right next to him. And he turned to me and he said, if the jackals glorify you, what is the benefit? In other words, don't try to get material glorification. Sometimes Srila Prabhupada would give us instructions, and we didn't really know where that was coming from. That happened with myself, but we could see, long term, that there was Prabhupada could understand our conditioning, and he would sometimes give us specific instructions for that difficulty or conditioned state. Unfortunately, the top of this picture is cut off. Srila Prabhupada, this is his arrival in Montreal, and he's speaking to a lady on the right. And Prabhupada's ecstatic expressions were just amazing to see. If he ever smiled at you, that was perfection of life. This is Damodar's film called The Full Nectarine. And what they were doing previously to this film, of course we see that Radha and Krishna are there dressed up, devotees dressed up. But they were doing, and they reported to Prabhupada what they were doing, and they were worshiping the dressed up Radha and Krishna as if they were Radha and Krishna themselves. And Krishna would take a bite of some fruit or something, and they would take that as their prasad, Krishna prasad. So they reported to Srila Prabhupada what they were doing. He was furious. He said, This is the most offensive measure. So we can understand that, that how easy it is to go off if we're not directed, especially in the beginning stages. But at all stages, we have to take shelter of the spiritual Master's instructions to make advancement. So anyway, this is from Brahmananda. Let me just put a little bit more. This is in New York. These are sisters, Ekiani and anyone else, I forget her name. Ekiani's on the right. There's the prasad. Srila Prabhupada actually, there was a scene that he was in. It's the end of the film, and Srila Prabhupada appears in the film. Of course, there's Krishna. And this is Brahmananda Prabhu's comments. When Srila Prabhupada saw how disappointed we were after his chastisement, he saved the situation by saying, "I can understand by this impulse that you want to know about the spiritual world in Radha and Krishna in Goloka. I will explain it to you." And then he just sat down and he started reciting the Brahma Samhita prayers. He gave a very elaborate description of those prayers, the Chintamani Dham and Radha and Krishna, how they look, how they appear, what they do. And he transported us to Goloka by his consciousness. Let's try to make this one. Again, some of these pictures are cut off inappropriately. This is an interview Srila Prabhupada gave in Boston. And this boy was asking different questions Srila Prabhupada was answering. Some very basic questions. And Srila Prabhupada's expressions during this interview were amazing. This is Prabhupada's arrival in Los Angeles in 1970 at the Vatsika Heavenly Temple. These are all gardenias. Srila Prabhupada loved gardenias. These were all gardenia garlands. This is Srila Prabhupada dancing at the San Francisco Rath Yatra. If you notice, Srila Prabhupada has a shirt on, and those are real pearl cufflinks. There's a story that Bhavananda Prabhu tells that he wanted to go out and buy these pearl cufflinks and buttons for Srila Prabhupada's shirt, and the president of the temple, they probably had no money at the time. And he was aghast that Srila Prabhupada, Bhavananda Prabhu wanted to buy real pearl cufflinks and buttons for Srila Prabhupada. So I was editing this film, and I put that story in the editing process. And then as Bhavananda was describing about purchasing these things, these cufflinks, Srila Prabhupada's arm went up in the film. You can see it right there. So sometimes these, in the editing of this massive material, we have some wonderful realizations that we're getting some help. Bhavananda Prabhu on the right. Srila Prabhupada's departure at San Francisco Airport. And he was very, very happy with the Rath Yatra. This is from Churya Prabhu. Prabhupada was so happy about the Rath Yatra festival and the success of it. He was just going on and on. He was saying, why have we done all this? Why have we put out all this energy to put on this festival? He began to speak that this is the compassion of the Vaishnava. For the purpose of benefiting others, the Vaishnava goes to such great lengths to see the preaching of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He said, this is Vaishnavism. This is Vaishnavism. Twice he said, and actually tears began to come to his eyes. When his tears came to his eyes, he couldn't speak anymore. This is the San Francisco Airport at Srila Prabhupada's departure. You can see the vintage film with a big scratch. You never see this today, of course. I mean, there were just uproarious kirtans in the airport. Unbelievable scene. And there's big posters you can see, Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Kishore Das Bhakti. They didn't put them up. Actually, I'd like to tell a story of the arrival in San Francisco. I was on a plane with Srila Prabhupada in 1974. And we knew that there was going to be a big reception, but we didn't understand how big it would be. I was up in the back of Srila Prabhupada, exiting the plane. You know how you look down the ramp? You know, walking through it. Anyway, down at the end of the ramp, there were devotees. They must have been piled on top of each other. Because all you could see was faces. You saw no bodies, just faces. Unbelievable scene. Devotees watching Srila Prabhupada board the plane. There's a great time going on. Anybody guess who that is on the left? Dinabandhu Prabhu. And Mahatma Prabhu on the right. So Srila Prabhupada handing out flowers in Los Angeles. This was his tradition that started. When he got back from his morning walk, the devotees would be lined up in front of the temple. And they would give Srila Prabhupada flowers, and they'd have flowers. So they would give Srila Prabhupada a flower, and he would give a flower back. It was a very sweet time. Srila Prabhupada was always very happy to see the children and interacted with them in very wonderful ways. You see, he himself was very happy at this time. Taking a turn in the LA Temple.
Interesting that no one's giving it to him, huh?
Yeah. This we'll discuss some difficulty that was going on in the LA Temple at that time.
Mm-hmm.
We interviewed Brahmananda Prabhu, who was very, very honest and open about the difficulty, and he was a big part of it. at that time, there was what was called the minimization of the spiritual master. And some think that came from India, certain groups in India. I'll read from Ramananda Prabhu, his description of that. At this time, there was what Prabhupada considered to be the minimization of the spiritual master by the leaders, mostly from myself. I was the most infected with this, I'd say, jealousy of the spiritual master. At this visit to Los Angeles, things were going wrong. From ISKCON Press, which I was in charge of, the books were printed. And Prabhupada's title was not properly put. It was just A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. His divine grace had been left out. Even one book, one of the Bhagavatam chapters, just had A.C. Bhaktivedanta. Even the Swami was removed. I presented Prabhupada the book from ISKCON Press from Boston that we printed, and he opened the book, and the binding just snapped right off. And this was in the temple when the formal presentation was made. When he went in the temple and he took the Charanamrita, he stopped and he said, "It is salt." Somebody put salt instead of sugar in the Charanamrita. And then on the altar they had placed the Acharya photos. I think it was Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's photo was placed upside down. To cure me of my disobedience, Prabhupada ordered me to take sannyas. And that sannyas would be a cure, because I had given up my position. I was in charge of the press in the New York Temple, and they all had to be given up. Sannyas was a purification. I had no choice in the matter. Prabhupada just came down the stairs and stood over me as I was bowing down, and he said, "Tridandi Goswami Brahmananda Swami," and walked out. Actually, I was always afraid that Srila Prabhupada would ask me to take sannyas. But here we can see Srila Prabhupada leaving Los Angeles Temple after all these things happened. Blissful. He actually said, "Don't mention this to the massive devotees. This should be kept confidential." Look at that garland. Turn down to the sweet. LA was a wonderful community. Very vibrant and Christian conscious. Srila Prabhupada's departure at the airport. Shalia, come from that. Kirtananda was very well.
Giant Tirtha in yellow
Yeah.
in the back.
So this was the first big Janmashtami celebration in New Vrindavan. This is Mother Lakshmana with the baby. Quite a crew. This was early as time. Actually, I had been to New Vrindavan just about 2 weeks before my first magazine article in the movement. It was done we covered the New York Temple and also New Vrindavan. And I had left just before this festival started. So here are the four sannyasis. And actually the trouble continued. There was a minimization of the spiritual master, and then there was what can we say? How would you say that, Sri?
They were saying Prabhupada was God.
Yeah. In other words, there was a minimization, but then there was the opposite extreme. And they were preaching that Srila Prabhupada was God. Even they were saying, when you read Bhagavad Gita, you should not say Srila Prabhupada, Sri Bhagavanu Bhattacharya, you should say Srila Prabhupada. So there was a lot of confusion.
Is there record from India also?
We don't know that for sure.
That was Prabhupada's analysis, was his godbrothers were putting this out there to destroy everything. And he said that what it meant was, if you say the spiritual master is God, then of course in the future, I become God, right? After the spiritual master leaves, then you become spiritual master, then you become God. But yeah, he felt the definite infection had come from, some of his godbrothers to try to destroy the movement.
Is this the dynamic Vishnu Jan Maharaj?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's Vishnu Jan on the right. Next to him is Subal, then Gardamuni, and then Ramananda. So they were preaching this poisonous philosophy, and Srila Prabhupada heard about it, and he ordered them to, he threw them out of ISKCON, basically, ordered them out of the temples. They could not come to temples. So the devotees put them in a van and drove them to Detroit Temple. And then Bhagavan Prabhu describes how they were basically locked up in a room. And finally, they were, after, I guess, overnight, and then they were asked to leave, and they just walked out in the street. They had absolutely no money. Ramananda Prabhu describes he had 25 cents. He had a quarter. That was all they had. And they just started walking. And the first night they ended up in Ann Arbor, not Ann Arbor, in Detroit, and they found some place to sleep where they were under some pine trees. There were some pine, cushion type, mattresses on the ground, and they just lay down and fell asleep. In the morning they woke up, and it turns out they were just opposite the Ford Motor Company, right at the gates of Ford Motor Company. And then they were completely famished. They didn't have any food. And then all of a sudden this little boy appeared, and he had a gallon of milk and bread. And he said, "Here, my mommy told me to give this to you." And he put it down and he ran away. Anyway, they survived. And they actually went to University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and they were preaching. That's the only thing they knew what to do. And they met Indraduma Swami there. Indraduma. And he took them in, and his idea, he loved the devotees. And he loved especially Vishnu Jan. He said, "I want to become like this man." Of course, he did that. So here we are in Mumbai. This is a banner, Prabhupada's World Sacred Time movement. So Srila Prabhupada in September of 1970, he took about 20, actually they came at different times, met Srila Prabhupada in India, and that was the first World Sankirtan party. Malati was there, Gurudas, Shamsundar, here's Nanda Kumar, and Yamuna Devi, just peeking over the top, and Gurudas. There were about 20 disciples. So here Srila Prabhupada sitting at a program in Mumbai. And Shamsundar Prabhu comments, "One time they were having a yogi sangha or sammelan, when many yogis come from all over India to speak at a venue on Chowpatty Beach in Bombay. Many different swamis and yogis were sitting up on the stage. You see the stage right there. And each day several of them, or one of them, would speak, and they invited Prabhupada and us to come down there. At first they didn't like the idea that Prabhupada would have us up there on the stage with him. But Prabhupada told them, these are Western Vaishnavas. These Western Vaishnavas are every bit as spiritually advanced as the other yogis and swamis here. I want them up here with me." And they agreed. Prabhupada was introducing us to India as the real authentic thing, that we were swamis and yogis in our own right. He was very proud of us. At the same time he was showing us his country, he was also showing his countrymen what he had done in the West. Huge crowds came down, and all very intelligent, high-class families came down to hear yogis speak. And here was Prabhupada stealing the show. No one could put on the show like we could. No one ever even came close. So after this, Prabhupada was sitting waiting to speak, and then he spoke. And then he had a kirtan. And this kirtan has turned into a huge event. First the devotees were on stage, and now they're down in the audience chanting. Small Krishna Goswami on the left, Dinanath Prabhu in the middle, great kirtan leader, Banu Swami on the right. That's Madeira? No, not
Yeah, I
Madhuri.
think Madhuri. That one
Krishna
there.
Goswami's first
That's Prajumna.
original wife. Perdumia?
Yeah, right there, that was Prajumna.
Where?
I think, right there.
No, that's Gopal. Srimad Gopal. He's from Canada. And then Srila Prabhupada at one point jumped down in the audience and started dancing. It was just a tremendous, incredible scene. Sometimes Srila Prabhupada would do that with these events where different yogis and swamis would speak. He would just take over the show. Just disrupt the whole event. I was with him in Kurukshetra. He was the same thing, he was invited to speak. In fact, he was made the president of the whole assembly, but he was invited to speak at the very end. So he sat there and listened to all these speeches. At the end, Prabhupada came on and he said, if you don't accept, and Krishna wasn't mentioned as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So when he came on to speak, he said, if you don't accept Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then this meeting is useless. Nothing will come of it. And then he got up and walked out. Very bold.
I was there
Yeah,
that
very,
time.
very provoking.
The whole time, Prabhupada had a certain thing that he did is sometimes, you see it in that video with Karjit Danyalo, when Prabhupada's waiting for his chance to speak and he's listening to nonsense from someone else, and he would start shaking his leg, and you'd see like his foot would bang. It was the only time Prabhupada ever did it. He would become just so outraged, and so this is when he would become impatient, and you'll see in that video, Prabhupada, his leg is shaking because he can't wait just to say what needs to be said. And this was like the only other time I saw him do that was in Kurukshetra, where all these yogis were getting up, and as you said, they were talking about unity. And Prabhupada spoke about it in the car after he left. And so they were all speaking. And as he said, they're in Kurukshetra. This is what he said in his lecture. He said, you're here in Kurukshetra where Krishna spoke Bhagavad Gita. He said, but no one mentions Krishna. He says, there's no question of unity. He said, without Krishna. He said, but no one. And he said, everything you're doing will be a complete failure. And so he got his opportunity. And on the way back from that program, there was like a hurricane on the way back to Delhi, and trees were falling all down around the car as it was driving by. It was like everything Prabhupada just finished, and I was thinking of what must have happened to this Pandal as these winds were blowing, how it just blew everything away. And in the car, Prabhupada asked, Ramananda was there too, so he asked, he said, did you understand? Because he was speaking in Hindi a lot. And we said, yes, we understood, because he was quoting slokas, Aham Sarvasya Prabhavo, Sarvadharman Pratyajaya. He was just speaking basic Bhagavad Gita. And he said, yes, I told them all, you're all a bunch of nonsense.
One thing that Prabhupada Prabhu he gives a very interesting comment about this program. He says, one of the speakers was one of the most famous Mayavadi sannyasis in Bombay, and Prabhupada knew his name. He was in the Shivananda line, which is the big Mayavadi Shivite line in India. Almost every one of the big gurus that came to the West was a disciple of Swami Shivananda of Bombay. And this guy was his successor. Then afterwards, Srila Prabhupada spoke and said, so you've been listening to such and such here, and he is very famous. And he mentioned him by name. And he is impersonalist. He does not believe that Radha Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But I will tell you something that I know. In secret, he is worshipping Radha and Krishna deities. And the man smiled real big. When Prabhupada had him, he said, even though he says he does not believe in God, that God is a person, he cannot resist worshipping Radha and Krishna. This is Yamuna Devi singing in one of the many times that Srila Prabhupada asked her to sing in India. He also asked another lady, disciple, Kaushalya, who were frequent kirtan leaders.
We had Jamuna give lectures as well.
Yeah. So this is an incredible experience for the early devotees. This is their first time in India. Srila Prabhupada was taking them from engagement to engagement. And here the devotees were at the Mathura Junction train station, waiting to go to Amritsar. So at every stop they would jump down and have kirtan. And Yamuna Dasi comments, Sankirtan at Mathura Junction station. This being such a holy place, and the first time that any of us had touched the holy Yam. We were in a trance of ecstasy, feeling Lord Krishna's presence by Srila Prabhupada's mercy. When we jumped from these trains to do kirtan, it was a life-giving aspect of our existence. The trains were just vehicles to take us from one kirtan to another. This is from Giriraj Swami. Practically all the pious and aristocratic Hindus in India, when they came to know about Srila Prabhupada and the work he had done to spread Sanatana Dharma in the West and throughout the world, they were astonished. They felt here is the first time that someone from India has gone abroad and really made an impact on people's lives, really brought people to Sanatana Dharma, to Krishna consciousness. And they wanted to come forward and help. They wanted to be a part of the great movement that Srila Prabhupada had started. At the same time, Srila Prabhupada had the idea that the people of India wanted to imitate the West. They want to imitate the Americans. Srila Prabhupada had the idea if the Americans take the Krishna consciousness, then the Indians see it, they will also want to imitate the Americans taking the Krishna consciousness. And actually Srila Prabhupada's thought worked. People looked again and again at their own tradition, at their own culture, at their own practices, and saw there must be more than what they even thought themselves. Otherwise, why would Americans and Europeans, with every chance to enjoy material facilities and sense gratification, why would they be chanting Hare Krishna and dancing, studying Bhagavad Gita and preaching? And why would they come to India? So they were thrilled. Sometimes they were so moved when they saw us that tears would come to their eyes. They were just so touched. This is Harinam in Amritsar. And anywhere Harinam is performed, big crowds would gather. This is probably, this is Surat in Gujarat. The Prabhupada stayed here for more than a week. And the reception here was unparalleled, unbelievable. This is Malati Devi. Gopal Prabhu. So this is where I met Srila Prabhupada. I arrived as a photographer, and I was doing my master's thesis in photography and the origins of Krishna consciousness in India, because I had some interest in my previous 2 jobs as a photographer for Earth Magazine and Asia Magazine, both articles on the devotees. So I got permission from my professors. They thought it was a far-out idea. And so I went to India, and I arrived in December 11th, 1970 in Bombay, and I had a address where the devotees were, so I went to that address, and they said, the person answered the door, and he said, "I'm sorry, they've gone to Surat." So I didn't know where Surat was. So he put me on a train that night, and I arrived in Surat. I had, again, I had no address. It was actually quite a large city. I thought it was a small town. And so the rickshaw walla came up to me and I said, "American Hare Krishna." And he said, "Get in." The whole town. They were the devotees were. In fact, in the newspaper every day they would print the route for the Sankirtan line. They had the whole thing organized. They would go to different sections of the city every day. So for a photographer, this was a dream come true. Just an incredible visual adventure. And coming from the streets of New York and photographing the devotees, it was a huge, big difference, of course. This is from Kaushalya Dasi. The citizens of Surat would greet us with sandalwood paste and kumkum, and many times they would come and give us bananas and mangoes and whatever kind of fruit they had. We were pulled into people's houses from the middle of kirtan and offered a cold lassi or sweets. The whole town was just suffused with Krishna consciousness. The entire town was on fire with devotion. We've done Harinam in many places, but the people made this an experience of a lifetime. Prabhupada was tireless. He would speak non-stop. He would greet the children and give them little sweets. And he would sit for hours and have darshan with thousands of people. People were just so kind to us and so genuinely sweet. You can see across the streets they would tie saris together and decorate. No, these are all taken from films. And here's the photographer. It was interesting when I met Srila Prabhupada. Of course, I was coming into the presence of wonderful devotees and Srila Prabhupada himself in his condition, you can see. Long
That's
hair,
you?
mustache. Yeah. So I met Srila Prabhupada, and I got to the door, rickshaw walla dropped me off. I knocked on the door, and the person who answered was the president of the New York Temple that I just met in New York. Gave me permission to do the article. That was Rishi Kumar. So I was pleasantly surprised, and we greeted each other. And he immediately took me to Srila Prabhupada. So I showed Prabhupada the magazine articles I had done. And asked and told him what I would like to do. I would like to stay with the devotees, travel with them, and take pictures. And so Srila Prabhupada looked at me and he said, "So you're going to become a devotee?" And to me, devotee is not, devotee kirtan, dancing in the street, shaved head. I said, "I don't think so, Srila Prabhupada." And he said something quite extraordinary. He said, "Then you cannot stay." I was crushed. So I didn't know what to make of that. It took me a long time to process that. In fact, it took about 2 months to process it, and by that time I was, very much internally, at least, a devotee. I stayed. I didn't say. I didn't leave, and Srila Prabhupada didn't say anything else. Sometimes Srila Prabhupada would speak, for the long term. Sometimes for the short term in his answers or comments. Sometimes for both, but this time it seemed to be for the long term, because he very kindly allowed me to stay. And internally, I was very attracted. So, of course, we know that Srila Prabhupada knew our hearts, so he could understand that. He just encouraged me. The second night I was there, they had a huge program. We blocked one end of the street off and put lights all the way down the street. People were hanging out. The street was completely packed. People were hanging out the windows. People were on the roof. Thousands and thousands of people. You couldn't, see to the end. So there was a kirtan, Srila Prabhupada spoke, and then he asked his disciples to speak one after another. And then he turned to me and asked me to speak. And I was completely, that was another bombshell. So I got up and I said a few words of appreciation to the people of Surat, how nicely they received the devotees. And it was a very short speech. And, in that way, Srila Prabhupada was encouraging. I'd sit with him in his room, and when anyone would come in, he would introduce me. He would say, "This is Mr. John. He is from America. He is an expert photographer, and he is appreciating our Krishna consciousness movement." Every time. So in Surat, Srila Prabhupada was taking morning walks along the river, pretty much alone with his servant. And here's a group of Boy Scouts who were on the morning walk, chanting and clapping. So anywhere the devotees went, they would preach. Anybody they saw, they would just, very boldly go up and start talking and making friends and preaching. One event in Surat, an outside event. It's very, amazing photographs. A beautiful setting, beautiful palm trees. Harinam party again. Actually, the mayor of one town that I'm not sure if it was Surat, but the mayor told devotees that even if Indira Gandhi came to their town, that she would not receive the reception she was Prabhupada. She was the prime minister. Here's Srila Prabhupada on his balcony. He would come out on his balcony regularly to greet the Harinam party when they returned. From Nandi Kumar Prabhu. Prabhupada said that when we were in Surat, this is a city of devotees. They basically closed off the whole town for Prabhupada. They would close off streets and have parades with him, and every shop would shut down. The man who we stayed at his home, Bhagavabai Jariwala, was a beautiful, small-bodied, elderly, very healthy-looking Indian banker. I remember we all had dysentery there. It was pretty serious, 20 sick devotees, including myself. And they just took care of us. They just kept taking care of us. Whatever we needed, they would take care of it. And at the end, when we left, Bhagavad Jariwala talked, and he said, I want to thank all of you for this wonderful experience. It's been an honor to serve you. And please forgive me for any offenses I've committed. And he started crying. And Prabhupada looked over at us and he said, just see, this is a Vaishnava. And then he gave us, all of us, money. After we had been offensive and sick in his house. But he never took offense. The whole family, they just served and served. And this is from Hansaduta Prabhu. Especially this program in Surat, every day they would take us to a different part of the town to do Harinam. And the devotees received just like they had flown in from the heavenly planet. It was just overwhelming. I remember at one point I started weeping because I could understand that this is what is meant by Lord Chaitanya's mercy and the flood of the Sankirtan movement. Because just a few years before, we were just on the street, vagrants and hippies and whatever. The potency of Prabhupada was manifested through his early disciples in cities like Surat in India, where people by the thousands were hanging out the windows off the roof in the street. It was packed wall to wall. They were so enchanted and mesmerized by the presence of the devotees chanting Hare Krishna. And you can understand that this was because of Prabhupada. We were just following behind him, like little ducklings follow the moon. So here we are at the Kumbh Mela, 1971, in Allahabad. This is one of the 6-year period of Kumbh Mela. It's very large. The estimated 7 million pilgrims came that year. Srila Prabhupada would have Harinam party every day. And he would come with us. Very, very cold. That's Vidas Swami on the far left, who bumbled with a cat. Vidas was brahmachari at the time, and rug over his head. Actually, you might want to know some of the names. Madhuvisa on the left, and Madhuri, and Tamal Krishna Goswami. Madhuri's baby was Tamal Krishna's first wife. The only one. And then Rivati Nanda behind Tamal Krishna. And then Aravinda. And then Srila Prabhupada. And behind Srila Prabhupada is, I think it's Tista Krishna. His name is Tista Krishna.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that was Tista Krishna.
And then
That's
it's
a-
Chitananda.
It's a Chutananda with the turban on, right?
Yeah, with her. And Giridhar, Shastramachari, Yamuna Devi, and Hansadev. Here Srila Prabhupada's shaving. He lived in a tent just like we lived. And went through a lot of inconvenience to be with his devotees in Kumbh Mela. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This is Srila Prabhupada in a rickshaw. And you actually can't see the whole thing, but he's got his hand on his cane. And we're going to the Gaudiya Math, the local Gaudiya Math. And Srila Prabhupada, of course, lived in Allahabad in his Grihastha days. And he actually donated these deities at that particular Gaudiya Math. And in that way he was doing service all the time. No, they were Radha Krishna Murti. So this is on the way to the Gaudiya Math. And this is Prabhu Das Brahmachari. we had an engagement at this ashram. He was reported to be 130 years old, but that was the report. But Srila Prabhupada actually said some of the yogis are hundreds of years old. You mentioned to Koshalya, she speaks about that. She says, I remember being amazed because it was the first time Prabhupada spoke about some of the cities that the yogis had there. He told us, you must be very careful because these are very powerful yogis. And that many of them have very powerful cities. And they can go down in the Ganga at the Himalayas. You come up here at the Triveni in Langa. They have the city to be able to move between places. He said, so you must be very respectful, very careful. Some of the Mataji's at the program, we had kirtan at that Prabhu Das Brahmachari's ashram. One of the days. You can see the people, their expression. You know, many of them, there was a mixture of feelings. That was my perceptions. Many of them were very proud. Probably most of them were very proud. But some of them felt a little awkward in our presence because they felt perhaps a little guilty that they weren't following as closely as we were. And so, you know, invariably though, people had a very strong response to the devotees in the early days. And still do in India. The preaching in India is tremendous. And Srila Prabhupada knew that, and therefore he went back to India in the very early days. You know, Kumbh Mela becomes a city of tents on the banks of the Ganga. She's a very enthusiastic devotee. And Srila Prabhupada met several times at different engagements in India. When he saw Prabhupada, he would start jumping up and down. And jump up to his feet and pay obeisance. Prabhupada, in the film, it just happened. And Prabhupada still got his smile. Saraswati. Actually, in the previous, you can see Saraswati on Shamsundar Prabhu's shoulders with her hands up in the air. She was a great preacher. She influenced many, many Indians. People were just amazed by her. She'd go out and say, you know, she would preach to people. She would say, you know what? And they would say, what? And she would say, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of God. And she went away. Prabhupada said she's a great preacher because she was speaking according to realization. This is in Benares. Srila Prabhupada was given a very nice reception in Benares, and there was I think it was Gaur Purnima. I forget. Srila Prabhupada, this is a chariot drawn by four white horses. The Prabhupada was taken through the streets, and the devotees were on this cart with little Indian boys dressed up as Krishna. Constituted Prabhu and there's Jayapataka Swami on the left. This is Dinanath Prabhu, great kirtan leader.
He was from India?
No, Dinanath Prabhu was from America. He lives in Washington, D.C. Still leads kirtan. Fantastic kirtan. Prabhupada riding in the car. I'm there to the left. Here's that same shirt Srila Prabhupada had on in the San Francisco Rasiata with the pearl buttons. This was quite unusual to have that kind of collar. This is not, and I think, yeah, Mataji made this in Los Angeles and gave it to me. And I think she was thinking that cowboy shirts have these collars, so drop like a cowboy. She connected that kind of like that. Sometimes in filming Srila Prabhupada, we'd have shots like this, and all of a sudden he would do this. He wouldn't try to action. And it would be very, I usually turn the camera off. Here's the deity in that procession. Cross Maidan Festival in Bombay. And this was one of the big pandals that Srila Prabhupada had in major cities in India. He had in Calcutta, he had in Bombay, he had in Delhi. Huge, huge program. 10 days. There'd be, all day there'd be programs, and in the evening Srila Prabhupada would speak. Many times he would speak in the morning, and also morning and evening. And Shamsundar arranged the advertising for this festival. And there were huge, huge billboards, just saying Hare Krishna, Cross Maidan, date. So he used Western style advertising techniques to really wow the Indians. Completely mesmerized. So tens of thousands of people came to the program. You can see it in the front, it's all people packed in. And this is the time, of course, that Prabhupada called Radhanath Swami onto the stage from the very back of the audience. And he was, you can see the size of the audience, he was way in the back. He asked Haridas to go to the back to bring him on stage and sit next to him. And so Radhanath Swami's comment was that, how does Prabhupada know who I am? And Haridas just dragged him up on the stage and sat there. And there was another devotee who was there, Daddy Harta Prabhu. And he heard Prabhupada's lecture and he couldn't understand anything. Prabhupada was speaking, or very little. But he understood that the lecture was all about surrender. And he knew that he wasn't ready for that. But he got the message, and eventually he did.
There's no picture of Radhanath Swami from this time.
No, there is.
Oh,
But it's very hard to see. It's way in the back. This is a wedding that was performed on stage, and this is Vagabond Group. And what's her name?
Padmavati.
yeah.
The United Nations.
Yeah. Prabhupada was very proud of this. Loved this man. He married him on stage at the Cross Maidan Bombay. Very, very, very happy. So I'll read something from Lokanath Swami. I was especially attracted by their appeal. It said, American sadhus are in town, European sadhus. I'd only heard of hardboard sadhus, or Vrindavan Mathura sadhus, or Panditpur sadhus, so I was curious. That time I didn't get to see Prabhupada, I was mostly meeting devotees, but I was very much impressed with Prabhupada's devotees, Prabhupada's followers. They were pretty dead serious, grave, convinced, knowledgeable, and I had these impressions. And if this was his followers and disciples, then I could only imagine their guru. Their spiritual master must be far, far superior. that's all today. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, you can answer a few questions.
I was thinking about this festival in Liverpool. Volunteer festival. They dress Gurukul, they was in Srinkaya, as Krishna. And Srila Prabhupada said, when a child is dressed as Krishna, then Krishna is there. And I was thinking about this when you showed the picture of the adult devotees dressed as Krishna. It's not the same.
Of course, there were plays. Prabhupada saw adults dressed as Krishna. I think it was more the consciousness that their understanding was off. This is actually Radha Krishna. And it's way off. Prabhupada saw plays with the Vaikuntha players performed in New York. Krishna kidnaps Rukmini. And Prabhupada loved that play. So, of course, Krishna dressed as an adult that dressed as Krishna. So it was more the consciousness, the understanding.
How much could you follow Prabhupada? And how did you travel with him just to film?
And sometimes I would travel with him to film. And sometimes I would meet him at different places. And I was with him about on and off for about 7 years. My wife was a still photographer also. We met in photography school. And she also came to India. By the way, I didn't go back for 2.5 years. And I forgot about my professor. He probably forgot about me. But it's interesting because we produced our first film, The Hare Krishna People. I came back from India to produce our first film on the request of Karanya Prabhu and Srila Prabhupada. A documentary on the movement. At that time there were no films. So Prabhupada actually financed that film, $14,000 from the book fund. And that was very unusual because normally it was just for temples and books. So he very kindly gave $14,000. He bought a camera, he bought the editing equipment, and round the world tickets. He started filming. So we produced that film in 1974. We released it at the Gore Printing Festival in Mayapur. And after that release, Prabhupada liked the film very much, and he gave us instructions to make more films, sell this film for the profits, make more films. And I asked him if I could support my family with it, and he said yes. So it was kind of one of the first businesses, you can say, this kind. And then I asked him if I should finish my thesis, my master's thesis. It was a bit on my mind at the time. He asked me how long will it take? And I said a few months. He said, then you can do it. He didn't want, some years of education. So I turned in the first Hare Krishna People film as the result of my investigation. And they liked it. And then I submitted a 30-page essay on the making of it. They didn't like that. They wanted like 100 pages and very detailed and lots of explanation, this and that. So I just forgot about it. And about 6 months later in the mail, I got the diploma. I graduated, finally.
Wasn't it the time Prabhupada was also not like taking so much picture?
He never, he didn't say that to me. He said it to someone else. But at one point I went to Denver after Los Angeles, filming him extensively in Los Angeles. I asked him if I could do a biography on his life, a film biography. And he agreed. First of all, he said, what is the need? And I said, in the future, Srila Prabhupada, so many people want to know who started the Hare Krishna movement. Srila Prabhupada's humility was very wonderful. And so he thought for a minute, and he agreed to that. So he allowed me to film him extensively in Los Angeles, 1975 visits. So I filmed in his bedroom, I filmed him translating. Not only myself, Vishaka Devi was also doing the sound. And on morning walks, anytime we had many conversations. And then I followed him. I said, whether I'm sitting here on the piazza sign or in LA, what is the difference? So I already had so many shots in LA. And then he basically stopped extensive filming. Although I took shots after that, now and then, but that was the end of the extensive covering. But he was concerned what I'd do next. He didn't just cut me off. He said, what will you do next? What will you do here in engagement? So I said that Kirtanananda Swami wants to film a new Vrindavan. And he liked that idea, so he gave me permission to do that film a new Vrindavan. So those early films are actually compiled into a 2 DVD set called ISKCON Cinema Classics. And it's all the early films of Srila Prabhupada. There are 8 films here. And 4 of them Srila Prabhupada saw himself. The Hare Krishna People, Brilliant as the Sun, Spiritual Frontier, and Spark of Life. So I think tomorrow we can discuss a little bit about Srila Prabhupada's instructions on those films and his reaction. Anything else?
He's traveling to India. Did Srila Prabhupada get Indian disciples that time?
There were very few Indian disciples. Very few. Again, in the beginning I remember maybe 2 or 3 traveled with our party. One was reported to be a CIA agent. At that time the government was very suspicious. And the responsibility there was very strict. He did get an and then eventually he left. He was in India. India. We don't know. Possibility. Very few individuals. So, yeah, it was rare.
When did the picture in India start?
People came to understand that we were genuine people. They were mixed reactions. Not many. The government. Generally, they were very warm. Srila Prabhupada's, formula for preaching in India was a huge success.
Sometimes we see today when we have festivals and things that devotees, they take very many pictures and film very much putting themselves in the center and taking over the stage. Did that sort of thing happen when Prabhupada was around?
There were a lot of cameras. Not many movie cameras. But not as much as today. But yeah, he was photographed. I think there's 10,000 or more pictures in the archive.
This is a personal question, but I was very curious how did you start the channel? Like, when you first came there and Srila Prabhupada told you that you could only film it to become a devotee, how did it happen for you to do that?
It was very gradual. It took me a long time. I came in contact December 1970 and then took initiation in November 71. October 71. So it was very gradual. It was, in my photography work, I was living with the devotees and wherever they lived. One place was a hotel that was given to us free of charge, rooms in the hotel in the early days in Bombay. So during Mangalarti, I would be in the bathroom developing my film in the bathtub. You know, I was just, doing my own thing, and I was, criticized by some. But I hung in there, and Srila Prabhupada was always very supportive. Actually, in Benares, I had left the Association of Devotees and went to see a friend in Benares from the Kumbh Mela. I left early. And then Srila Prabhupada came to Benares, and I joined the devotees there. I came to the house where they were staying, and I walked in, and Srila Prabhupada was sitting with his shirt off just after a massage, and had broken a pot of gur, and he had handed the pieces around, and everybody, he had dipped his fingers in and was licking from the pot, and he broke the pot and handed the pieces to the devotees. Very wonderful scene. And Srila Prabhupada was talking about the early days in Calcutta. What a beautiful city Calcutta was. And then he looked at me and he said, he was smiling very big, and he said, Krishna has captured you. So that was confirmation from Prabhupada. That was a good one. Anything else? What time is it? Is it time?
10
Time to end?
10 past 2.
What time does it go to?
1:45.
Quarter to 2.
No, 2 o'clock.
All right. Well, thank you very much. You're such a wonderful group.
Thank you.
Yadavara Prabhu ki jai. Prabhupada ki jai.